We had this timeline, and we start that one in October of 2002. That's actually before even the term net neutrality was coined. But that was a case that was reviewing some FCC decisions where the FCC decided how they were going to treat the kind of new technologies of broadband internet, of DSL and cable internet. And a lot of the decisions the FCC made then have had major ramifications for net neutrality. Net neutrality is the principle that the company that connects you to the internet doesn't get to control what you do on the internet. That ISP should not be in a position to be, a gatekeeper or a toll booth or someone who gets to decide that, yeah, this part of the internet, it's only really going to work if we bless it, if we like it. You actually shouldn't have to care what your internet service provider thinks about any website you visit. Their job is to connect you to whatever website you want. And so net neutrality is the set of rules and the principles that maintains that status quo of how the internet has essentially always worked. There are a lot of ways to think about what the negative implications of a non-neutral internet would be. Everything that's sort of stuck in the slow lane, not because the ISP is targeting it, because the ISP doesn't really care about it. All of those things get stuck in this sort of second tier internet. But everyone has kind of this internet map of their own, and it's full of all these sort of random niche corners. And all of those corners get left behind and degraded when they're stuck in the slow lane. You end up in these like crazy corners of the internet with rich sources of information, but not getting millions of hits a day. And those are the kind of sites that really lose out when you start bifurcating the internet and slowing down big chunks of it. One of the reasons we want net neutrality is because this virtuous cycle has been incredibly helpful for the internet. You can start the cycle wherever you want, but let's say you have someone who builds a great new app and it requires faster speeds than old apps. What happens? People go to they say this app is amazing. They go to their ISP, they say, I want a faster internet connection. The ISP makes more money. It takes that money, it invests it in the network to speed the overall network up, which then opens the door to someone else to come along to build the next app, the next use that requires more speed. And then you get back in that cycle. And that cycle is what drives all it, but the cycle requires among all the pieces that new apps, new uses of the internet can just exist online, that people can start something new to fuel that growth and that innovation.
I mean, I've heard a lot of portrayal of net neutrality as a partisan issue. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird because you wouldn't think it would be a partisan issue. Initially, kind of early on, it wasn't a partisan issue, but for all kinds of reasons, it's really unfortunate that right now we're in a little bit of a place where there is a high level of partisanship connected to net neutrality. And I think it's unfortunate because I don't think that the net neutrality debate really fits in along ideological and partisan lines. The Republicans benefit from all sorts of open internet the same way Democrats do, right? The Republicans have YouTube channels. The Republicans use Twitter. They have all sorts of crazy, email stuff that they send out. And all those services were developed on an open internet. They benefit from it just from a purely sort of selfish, we're going to win elections standpoint. The thing about the ISPs is not only that they are big, but they operate, and they've operated for decades within a highly regulated framework. And as a result of that, the ISPs are just much more sophisticated and spend a lot more money in Washington engaged in policy debates than almost anyone else, any other kind of industry, and certainly a lot of public interest groups. So they are just big, sophisticated players with long, expensive histories in these debates. And so they are very, very good at fighting for their interests when you come to things like this. Big, powerful, sophisticated lobbying operations like the ISPs have, they work best when people aren't paying attention, when it is kind of an obscure issue, when the only people who are really engaged on it are kind of big industry players. In those cases, lawmakers, decision makers, people, whatever the regulatory agency is, they end up being very engaged traditionally and often with the industry position. But as an issue kind of moves its way up the ladder and becomes a top tier premier issue, which I think it's safe to say that net neutrality has become, the power of those expensive lobbyists and those businesses go down, because then all of a sudden, all the decision makers realize that the public is really engaged in this and they'll really be watching what decisions are made. And in those situations, that's when the positions that a public interest organization like Public Knowledge would assert, that's basically when we win. We win when people are engaged and paying attention. When that happens, all of a sudden, it doesn't eliminate the power of the ISPs, and it still is an incredibly hard fight, but that's where the balance comes out. And people are cynical and they're like, oh, there's nothing you can do when you have the entrenched forces. And I think that it has been the story of everyday people really pushing back against huge incumbent ISP interests and winning. And just like winning battle after battle after battle. It's not done, but there is an ability to push back against that. When we show up at the FCC and say, this is what we think is the right issue, and there are 4 million people who've taken the time to weigh in with you about it, who agree with us, that's a completely different conversation. And so those requests to kind of weigh in are very real and they're unbelievably effective. That's the way that it works. The way that you take, policy decisions back from entrenched interests is basically to tell your member of Congress or the decision maker you're paying attention. You would be shocked how few phone calls it takes to, a member of the House of Representatives office from constituents before they call us and they're like, so there's this net neutrality thing. A lot of people are telling us it's important. We need to know what's going on. I mean, you get like 40 phone calls in a concentrated period of time to an office. That'll get their attention. You get, 100 phone calls to a Senate office. That'll get your attention. I know on some level you can say, oh, well, the ISPs might actively interfere with that. And, that could be true. But you don't even have to think that to be worried, because on a non-neutral net, I mean, if I think of all the digital tools that we use to get people information, to get people engaged, to activate them, how many of those tools simply wouldn't have been created on a non-neutral internet?
Bleak, dark internet future.
we can avoid that future with a strong net neutrality rule. So that's the key. We don't want that future. That's the Biff owns the cops future. We can still have a good future, positive future. I mean, it wouldn't look good. I think in the short term, what it would look like is a handful of websites and services that are already successful, that can afford to pay off ISPs, will do so. And so they will keep operating. And a bunch of the services that can't will either fold or be stuck in the slow lane. And then kind of in the medium term, you'll get a greater and greater divergence between the fast lane and the slow lane. So if you think about it now, when a new web platform, when a new service, when a new kind of whatever for the internet is made, it's made in a way that operates across the open internet. So even if it was developed at some huge company that has all sorts of money to throw at ISPs they had to, it still technically works for anybody. And so you will see less of that because you'll see new services kind of optimized for the fast lane. And then in the long term, and this is almost, in some ways, this is kind of the most frustrating part, is there are all these things that will occur to people to do online. Some of them commercial, some of them just sort of community building, where when they look at how the internet is working and sort of the fast lane, slow lane, and if they can't pay the toll for the gatekeeper ISP, they just kind of won't pursue those things. And so we're going to need to kind of mobilize everyone. And so the thing that you can do now is make sure you are engaged. So when the call goes out, it finds you, and then you can say, yes.
All right. Hear that, people of the future? Let's make
people of the future.
Keep the internet neutral.
I'm telling you to do it. This is an important issue that impacts everything that is done online. And we're in this moment right now where those fundamental rules are being written both as we speak and as you are listening to this podcast right now. And that's the time where policymakers and decision makers really need to hear from people outside of Washington that this really is important. And so take it seriously and know that when you do weigh in, it makes a huge difference